Ask any economics textbook what caused the panic of 1907, and you'll get the same tidy answer. Two greedy speculators tried to corner a copper stock. The scheme blew up in their faces, and the resulting shockwave nearly toppled the American banking system. Case closed. Lesson learned. Move on to the next chapter. Except that answer is almost designed to make you stop asking questions. It's the financial equivalent of blaming a wildfire on a dropped cigarette while ignoring the drought, the decades of unmanaged brush, and the landowners who happened to have fire insurance on every tree that burned. The copper scheme was real. The men who tried it were real fools. But the fire had been waiting to happen for a very long time. And there were people standing close enough to the flames who understood exactly how useful a good disaster could be. Because here's what most retellings conveniently leave out. The Panic of 1907 wasn't really a story about a failed stock manipulation. It was the story of how a small handful of private citizens, led by one aging financier, quietly assumed the powers of a national government, decided which banks lived and which ones died, walked away with one of the largest industrial acquisitions in American history, and then spent the following 6 years designing the very institution that would inherit their authority forever. And they did most of it without a single vote being cast. So if you're ready to hear the version they don't put in the textbooks, let's start 17 months before anyone on Wall Street had ever heard the word panic, in a city that had just been leveled to the ground. And stick with me here, none, because the next part of this story almost never gets told correctly. It starts not on Wall Street, but underneath an entire city. At just past 5 in the morning on April 18th, 1906, San Francisco began to shake apart. The earthquake itself was over in under a minute, but what followed was almost biblical. Ruptured gas lines turned entire neighborhoods into infernos that burned for 3 straight days, consuming roughly 500 city blocks. More than 3,000 people died. Over half the city's residents lost their homes. When the smoke cleared, the damage was estimated at $400 million, a figure that would translate to well over $12 billion today. One of the richest cities on the West Coast had essentially been wiped off the map. Now, most accounts of the 1907 panic treat the earthquake as a footnote, a single sentence before jumping straight to Wall Street. That's a mistake, because the earthquake didn't just flatten buildings. It set off a chain reaction that traveled across an entire ocean and rewired the global flow of money. And the mechanism was something almost nobody thinks about: insurance. At the time, the majority of the policies covering San Francisco's property weren't held by American firms. They belonged to British and European insurers, Lloyd's of London chief among them. To pay out the flood of claims, enormous quantities of physical gold had to be shipped from London to the United States. Remember, this was the gold standard era. Currency wasn't an abstraction sitting on a server somewhere. It was metal, and metal has to physically move. As that gold drained out of London through late 1906, the Bank of England grew nervous, then alarmed. Its reserves were bleeding out fast, so it did the only thing a central bank can do in that position. It raised rates aggressively, from 3.5% all the way to 6%, trying to pull gold back home. Other European banks followed, and just like that, credit across the Atlantic began tightening like a hand closing around a throat. But here's what should really worry you. The country had absolutely nothing in place to stop what was coming next. Here's where it gets genuinely dangerous, though. The United States, in 1906, had no central bank. None. No Federal Reserve, no institution with any legal authority to expand credit when the system needed it, or contract panic when it spread. What America had instead was a patchwork of national banks, state banks, and a rapidly expanding category of institution that would soon become the epicenter of the entire crisis: the trust company. We'll get to them shortly. First, understand the scale of what was already unraveling. Between September 1906 and March 1907, the American stock market quietly lost around 8% of its value. That may sound modest by today's standards, but remember, there were no circuit breakers, no deposit insurance, no lender of last resort. An 8% slide with no safety net underneath it was enough to rattle every boardroom in New York. By May 1907, the country had officially slid into recession. And all of this happened months before anyone had ever heard the names Augustus Heinz or Charles Morse. Retention. Hook. Now, here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. What if the men who eventually rescued, or the system, were the same people who benefited most from letting parts of it collapse first? Keep that in the back of your mind, because we're about to meet them. To understand why this crisis spread the way it did, you need to understand trust companies. And this is where most historical retellings quietly skip over the most important part of the story. Trust companies had originally existed to manage estates and handle fiduciary business for wealthy families. But by the early 1900s, they'd evolved into something else entirely: quasi-banks that took deposits, made loans, and speculated in the market, all while operating under a fraction of the oversight that real banks faced. National banks in New York were legally required to hold cash reserves equal to roughly 25% of deposits. Trust companies were only required to hold about 5%. That difference made trusts wildly profitable and wildly fragile. A 5% reserve is fine until depositors show up all at once demanding their money back. Then it's a death sentence. And there was another detail that made trust companies uniquely vulnerable. They weren't members of the New York Clearinghouse. The Clearinghouse functioned as the closest thing the city had to an emergency backstop, a private alliance of major banks that could pool resources and issue emergency credit during a crisis. Trust companies had no seat at that table. They were, in the language we'd use today, shadow banks, enjoying all the profits of high leverage with none of the protection that came with belonging to the club. By 1907, trust company assets in New York had grown to nearly match those of the national banks. They had become too big to ignore and too unregulated to trust, and yet almost nobody in power was paying attention to how dangerous that combination had become. The national banks resented them, and when the moment came to decide who deserved saving, that resentment would matter enormously. There's one more piece of this puzzle that almost never makes it into the popular retelling. The very bankers who ran the national institutions, the ones with the 25% reserve requirements, the ones who belonged to the clearinghouse, were fully aware of how exposed the trust companies had become. Some of them had even quietly warned regulators, in private, that the arrangement was unsustainable. But an unregulated competitor bleeding out wasn't exactly bad news for the men who ran the regulated banks next door. When the moment of truth finally arrived, that quiet awareness would shape who got a rescue call and who got left to answer their own phones. So picture the landscape right before the spark hit. A global credit crunch triggered by a natural disaster thousands of miles away. A recession already underway. A shadow banking sector holding dangerously thin reserves. And no institution anywhere with the legal power to step in. All that was missing was a match. And the match arrived from, of all places, a copper mine in Montana. Frederick Augustus Heinze was the kind of man Hollywood would later invent characters to imitate. Born into wealth in Brooklyn, trained at the Columbia School of Mines, he headed west in his 20s and made his fortune in Butte, Montana, by waging open legal warfare against Amalgamated Copper, the mining giant effectively controlled by Rockefeller and Standard Oil money. Heinze exploited an obscure mining law to claim that copper veins running under his rival's land technically belonged to him, and he fought that claim through the courts for years, winning again and again, until Amalgamated finally paid him roughly $12 million just to make him go away. What happens to this man next is exactly what triggers the collapse you're waiting for, so don't go anywhere. He arrived in New York in 1906 with about $25 million and a plan to become a financial titan. But New York wasn't Butte. In Montana, he'd been a folk hero, the scrappy outsider beating the corporate machine. On Wall Street, he was just an outsider, full stop. He found a partner in Charles W. Morse, a man who had made his own fortune cornering an entirely different market, ice. In the days before refrigeration, ice was essential infrastructure, and Morse had bought up enough ice companies to effectively control supply for an entire city, until public pressure and price gouging accusations forced him out. Morse simply pivoted, the way ambitious men in that era always seemed to, from commodities into banking, quietly accumulating seats on one board after another until he had built himself a private empire almost nobody outside Wall Street had noticed. By 1907, Heinze and Morse together controlled seats on 6 national banks, 10 state banks, 5 trust companies, and 4 insurance firms, a web of influence so tangled that when one thread snapped, there was almost no way to stop the vibration from reaching every other part of the system. Here's your first real reason to keep watching. Because what happens next is the moment where a single miscalculation turns into a national catastrophe, and it happens almost by accident. Heinze and Morse decided to corner the market in United Copper stock, betting that short sellers had borrowed more shares than actually existed and could be squeezed into paying whatever price they demanded. It's an old trick, and it can work beautifully, if your math is right. Heinze's brother Otto was convinced the family controlled far more of the outstanding stock than it actually did. Charles Barney, president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, was approached to help finance the operation and refused, warning them they didn't have nearly enough capital. Otto went ahead anyway. On October 14th, 1907, Otto began buying aggressively. Within 15 minutes, the stock rocketed from $39 to $60. For about a day, it looked like the gamble was paying off. Then it fell apart. The short sellers had no trouble finding shares. The supply the Heinzes thought was locked up was floating freely. There's strong circumstantial evidence that Rockefeller-aligned interests deliberately sold into the rally to break the squeeze, settling an old score from the Montana courtroom battles. By October 16th, the stock had collapsed from $60 to $10. Otto was ruined. Augustus wasn't far behind. That should have been the end of it. A failed speculation, 2 humiliated men, a minor Wall Street scandal. Instead, it was only the beginning. Most tellings of what happened next describe it as contagion, panic spreading like a virus from one bank to the next. An almost natural, unavoidable process. That framing is comforting, and it's also misleading because it hides something much colder. A series of deliberate human decisions about who would be rescued and who would be allowed to fail. What you're about to see is a run on a trust company that most people have never heard of, and it's the single event that turns this into a national emergency. The first bank hit by withdrawals was Heinz's own Mercantile National. The clearinghouse inspected its books, declared it solvent, and publicly backed it. The run stopped almost immediately. At that point, there was still no systemic panic. Everything changed the moment word spread that Charles Barney, president of Knickerbocker Trust, had personal ties to Heinze and Morse. Barney had refused to fund their scheme, but the association alone was enough. A run began at Knickerbocker's doors. Knickerbocker held over $60 million in assets, was one of the most respected trusts in the country, and, like every trust company, was sitting on roughly 5% reserves. It could survive almost anything except a genuine run, and a genuine run is exactly what it got. This is the moment J.P. Morgan enters the story, and not, as generations of textbooks would have you believe, as a selfless savior swooping in to rescue the nation out of the goodness of his heart. Morgan was in Richmond attending a church convention when word reached him. He cut his trip short, returned to New York, and assembled what was, in every practical sense, a private central bank. George F. Baker of First National, James Stillman of National City Bank, and himself. 3 men, no votes, no oversight, deciding the fate of an entire financial system over the course of a few tense weeks. Morgan sent a young banker named Benjamin Strong to examine Knickerbocker's books. Strong couldn't reach a conclusion in the time available. Morgan chose not to help. That same afternoon, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would stop clearing checks for Knickerbocker, effectively a death sentence, since a trust that can't clear checks can't function. The next morning, depositors lined up around the block. Within 3 hours, they pulled nearly $8 million out. By noon, Knickerbocker had shut its doors, and the panic, the real nationwide panic, had officially begun. Now stay with me here, because this next part is the single most important thing in this entire story, the detail that changes everything about how you should read the rest of it. Morgan had the resources to keep Knickerbocker alive, while Strong finished the audit. He chose not to. And Knickerbocker's collapse was the exact event that turned a contained scare into a national emergency. Once it fell, the run spread, and the next one hit the Trust Company of America. This time, Strong's audit came back clean. This time, Morgan opened his wallet, releasing millions of his own money and pulling together a $25 million pool to stop overnight lending rates from spiking past 100%, a level that would have shut the entire stock exchange down within days. So ask yourself the obvious question. If Morgan had the power to save Knickerbocker and chose not to use it while saving the next trust in line almost immediately after, what exactly determined who got rescued? A careful audit? Or the value of what letting one institution die would set in motion? We'll come back to that question because Morgan wasn't finished, and what he did next might be the most brazen use of a national crisis in American financial history. What Morgan does next might be the single most brazen move in this entire story. A man using a national emergency to buy a competitor at a discount. By early November 1907, the brokerage firm Moore and Schley was on the verge of collapse, having borrowed heavily against stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. As the panic pushed prices down, that collateral was evaporating, and creditors were closing in. If the firm went under, it threatened to trigger a fresh wave of selling that could bring down the exchange entirely. Morgan proposed a fix. His own company, United States Steel, would absorb Tennessee Coal in exchange for bonds, instantly shoring up Moore and Schley's balance sheet. There was only one problem. U.S. Steel already dominated the American steel industry, and this was the height of the trust-busting era under Theodore Roosevelt. So Morgan sent 2 of his closest allies to Washington before dawn to wake the president and pitch the deal directly, framing it as an act of public rescue rather than what it actually was, a chance to absorb a major competitor at a steep discount while the country was too busy panicking to object. Roosevelt, under enormous pressure and with limited time to think it through, approved it. U.S. Steel picked up Tennessee Coal for roughly $39 million in bonds, a price later analysis suggested was a fraction of what its iron ore reserves alone were actually worth. The government tried to unwind the deal years later. The case dragged on for nearly a decade. USA Steel won. By late November, the panic itself had passed. But its aftershocks would reshape the country for the next 100 years, and this is where the story gets truly uncomfortable, because the standard version of what happened next is, at best, half the truth. Everything you think you know about how the Federal Reserve was created is about to get a lot more complicated. The textbook version says the panic exposed the dangers of a financial system with no central bank. So wise policymakers built the Federal Reserve to make sure it never happened again. Simple, tidy, reassuring, also deeply incomplete. In the panic's aftermath, Congress formed the National Monetary Commission, chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a man who happened to be the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., and whose ties to the banking world were so deep that critics openly accused him of working for Wall Street rather than the public. In November 1910, Aldrich quietly organized one of the most secretive gatherings in American economic history. A small circle of the country's most powerful bankers traveled under false names to a private retreat off the Georgia coast, telling the press they were going duck hunting. For 10 days, they drafted the blueprint for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System, designed almost entirely by the very men that system was supposedly created to regulate. The secrecy wasn't accidental. They understood exactly how the public would react if it knew the truth. 2 years later, the Pujo Committee investigated what critics were already calling the money trust, a small network of financiers accused of quietly controlling the nation's credit. Its final report found that a handful of banking institutions, led by Morgan and Rockefeller interests, held hundreds of directorships across more than 100 corporations, controlling resources worth over $22 billion in an economy whose entire output was only around $35 billion. And what did lawmakers do with that finding? They didn't break the concentration up. They formalized it into the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, whose most powerful branch, the New York Fed, was handed to Benjamin Strong, the same man who had examined Knickerbocker's books during the panic. Morgan's man. To be fair, the country genuinely did need a central bank. The old system really was too fragile for a modern economy, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But look at the full arc of the story. Before the panic, Morgan was simply one powerful financier among several. After it, he was the man credited with single-handedly saving the nation, and he'd walked away with a major steel acquisition in the process. Before the panic, trust companies competed freely outside the old banking establishment. After it, they were folded under tighter control, quietly eliminating a source of competition for the banks Morgan's circle already dominated. Before the panic, there was no central authority over American money. After it, there was, and its most important seat was filled by Morgan's own protege. Before we get to the ending, there's one uncomfortable question worth asking directly. None of this proves Morgan engineered the crisis deliberately. He almost certainly didn't. The earthquake, the reckless speculators, the fragile trust companies, none of that was his design. But the way he moved through the crisis, choosing exactly who to save and who to let fall, acquiring a major rival under the cover of emergency, and leaving behind an institutional structure run by his own allies, all of that adds up to something far more calculated than the humble rescue story usually told in classrooms. Morgan reportedly once brushed off criticism about his outsized influence by saying he simply tried to be useful when the market needed him. It's a modest line for a man who had just decided the financial fate of an entire nation. But maybe that's exactly the lesson worth taking from all of this. That being useful at precisely the right moment to precisely the right people is its own form of power. Powerful enough, in this case, to reshape a country. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve Act was signed, never living to see the institution his choices had made almost inevitable. When his estate was finally settled, his fortune turned out to be far smaller than people assumed, somewhere around $80 million. Rockefeller, on hearing the number, reportedly remarked with genuine surprise that he hadn't realized Morgan wasn't even a truly rich man. It was a sharp line, and it completely missed the point. Morgan's power was never really about the size of his bank account. It was about sitting at the exact center of a web of debts, favors, and relationships that let him move markets and governments with a single phone call. There's a pattern here worth naming clearly, because it doesn't stop in 1907. Nearly every major financial crisis since has followed the same basic script. Chaos exposes a broken system, a small circle of insiders steps in to manage the damage, and the institutions built afterward to fix things tend to be run by people who look remarkably similar to the ones who profited from the mess in the first place. The public pays the tuition for these lessons in savings, jobs, and shattered trust. The architects of the recovery collect the diploma. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just what happens when a handful of people control both the emergency response and the design of whatever comes after it. So the next time someone tells you the panic of 1907 was just two reckless speculators who got greedy with copper stock, you can tell them they've got the story upside down. The copper scheme was the spark. The earthquake was the wind that carried it. The trust companies were the dry brush waiting to catch. But the fire was always going to happen because the whole system had been quietly built to burn. And the men who designed what rose from the ashes were standing just far enough away to keep their hands perfectly clean. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos that dig past the textbook version of events. And if this one hooked you, go watch our breakdown on the Rothschild banking dynasty next, because the thread's connecting. The story to this one go a lot deeper than most people realize. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.